Hello, I'm Dave Christie with the LaRouche organization, and today I am joined by Mike Billington, the Asia Intelligence Director of Executive Intelligence Review. And Mike was also instrumental in putting together the Great Reset pamphlet, The Great Leap Backwards, the Green New Deal, which you can find on the LaRouche organization website. This is the weapon that we have at our disposal for eliminating and crushing the British monarchy's plan for depopulation versus via environmentalism. Now, Mike contributed to that pamphlet as well with an article entitled BlackRock Inc. How Green Finance Forbids Modern Fuels. And in that, of course, Mike takes up the question of BlackRock. Now, Mike, maybe just to give people a sense of this, because Karel Verhaken has an article as well, which kind of gives a little bit of the history of BlackRock and describes their rise as one of these sort of unique classes of so-called asset managers beyond the beyond regulation of governments. But certainly these asset managers like BlackRock have risen to kind of astronomical power. But and they kind of, well, anyway, maybe you could just give people a sense of what is their agenda or who is deploying them.
Well, BlackRock is not a household name the way J.P. Morgan or something, the big banking interests. It's not a bank. It's what they sometimes call a non-bank. Its actual equity is not that enormous. It's several $100 billion, but it's a company which controls $8+ trillion. In other words, they manage rich people's money. And when you have $8+ trillion, trillion, not billion, 8 trillion, 8,000 billion in money to invest in stocks and bonds and so forth in companies all over the world, hundreds and hundreds of companies, you have enormous power. You have the power to invest or not invest or to divest. You have the power of sitting on their boards and being able to vote out executives who don't follow your intention. And not only do they have power, but they are a leading figure in this green finance operation. In 2017, the thing called the Network for Greening the Financial System was set up, which is made up of about 85 central banks. And at the famous Jackson Hole meeting in 2019, the head of BlackRock, Michael Fink, and his associate, whose name is Philip Hildebrand, they basically declared that they are launching a regime change in the world financial system. And as you've discussed in others of these interviews and the report itself, the point here is that we have the fact that the central banks, the too big to fail banks, and these mammoth so-called non-banks, asset management companies, have declared that they are taking the power of government away from elected governments, away from sovereign governments, and giving the power over the economy of every country on earth to this group of banking fanatics. The fact that they are fanatics is not hard to prove. Their intent is to prevent the continued industrial development and to actually shut down industrial development globally while they create a huge new bubble to try to bail out the global financial bubble, which is now the biggest in the history of humanity and is ready to blow apart. They declared at that Jackson Hole meeting that that it would no longer work to just continue with quantitative easing. Simply printing money is not going to work. All credit must be diverted from investments in the real economy into bailing out banks or investing in this green bubble. So that's by and large where BlackRock came from. The power they hold is just enormous. And the article that I contributed to the pamphlet on ending this Green New Deal focused on them as perhaps the leading hitman to impose these policies on companies and even on governments around the world.
Well, you have a number of examples in your article detailing what they've actually done. Some of what you covered was the KEPCO, the South Korean energy company. Maybe you could just give a brief sense of what you think are an example of how BlackRock is able to carry out this level of intimidation.
Right. This is clearly one of the best examples. KEPCO is an enormous company. It's South Korea's, it stands for Korea Electric Power Company. They're majority government owned, so it's a government business primarily. It invests, it builds nuclear plants, coal power plants, other kinds of power, not only in Korea, but around the world. In fact, they're invested in 27 countries around the world, about 80% of that in fossil fuels, most of it coal. They build nuclear power plants in UAE. This is a big, big power company doing the kind of thing, for instance, that China is doing, building huge energy power infrastructure around the world. So BlackRock last year wrote to KEPCO and said, you are building coal plants in Vietnam and Indonesia. Either you stop or we will crush you. We will divest. We will vote your executives out on the board. And they're not only talking with their own personal control over their investments, but basically everyone knows that this is the core of this global central bank, too big to fail banking interests. And in fact, pretty much immediately after BlackRock gave them this ultimatum, another major company in England called LGIM, had about $1.5 trillion. They basically backed it up and told KEPCO that they had to divest or else. Now, this began with these two coal plants, which were already underway. KEPCO basically bargained and said they were not going to shut down the two plants that were already underway, but they pledged that they would cancel all the contracts they had to build major coal plants anywhere in the world, including even within Korea. This immediately hit the Philippines, where a major coal plant was contracted for, a 1,000 megawatt coal plant, huge, clean coal. It was going to replace an old coal plant that was dirtier. That was canceled. Same thing in South Africa, two major plants. Here's South Africa with blackouts, with a pandemic, the most developed country in Africa, and yet still suffering enormously economically. And of course, if you shut down coal plants in the rest of Africa, where 90% of their energy comes from coal, we are recognizing here that this is a major part of the depopulation, the Malthusian genocide, which is the intention of the royal family, as documented in our report, Prince Charles and the royals, who have run this process from the beginning, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, using this fake science, this idea that carbon somehow is going to burn up the world, to convey the lie that we are doing this in order to stop climate change, when in fact they're doing it to maintain the power of the British Empire, the City of London, Wall Street's financial institutions, utterly bankrupt, creating this green bubble and simply diverting credit away from anything productive, not only fossil fuel plants, but any industry and agriculture when it produces too much carbon, because carbon supposedly is the devil. So this is how KEPCO worked. Let me add that the direct impact on governments themselves was evident here when they shut down the contract to build the power plant in the Philippines. Within days, the energy minister from the Philippines announced that the Philippines henceforth will never build another coal-fired plant, period. Obviously, it instructed that if they want to have any support from these international financial institutions, they had to follow these dictates. Governments no longer run their economy. These financial dictators centered in the City of London and Wall Street, the British Empire essentially, now are taking control in front of our eyes. This moment, they're doing this with the intent of forcing the world population to accept this idea that we can no longer be industrial, we can no longer support 7 or 8 billion people. We're going to have to accept this lie that the world can only maintain 1 or 2 billion people. It has a carrying capacity. We're running out of resources, climate change, all these fake science operations, which are very close now to implementing a irreversible, intentional, forced breakdown of global industry, global agriculture, and most importantly, power generation.
Well, and it obviously flies in the face of the kind of development that is actually, or there's a conflict between the type of development that you're also seeing led by China, which is building coal and nuclear in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. That definitely leads to the kind of conflict which Helga has identified of world war, and certainly China is a target for their commitment to this kind of development. How do you see
Yeah,
that playing out? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very important. China is doing, Korea and Japan were doing these kinds of things. They were trying. China's doing it on a huge scale with the Belt and Road. And when Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State for Joe Biden, who's a fanatic supporter of this Green New Deal, when he was asked, are you going to stop investments in coal production in the third world? He said, yes, but we have a problem, which is most of the coal plants being built in the developing sector are being built by China, and they're being financed by China. And therefore, our power through the international financial institutions and the City of London and Wall Street banking interests cannot stop it. And this has to be considered by people when they recognize that this attack on China is an attack on the development of the human race, not just an attack on China. It's an attack on the idea of development, what was historically known as the American system of peace through development, which is now being implemented more by the Chinese, more of a Hamiltonian economic policy in China than we have here in the United States under this takeover of government by these financial institutions. And we, of course, are absolutely committed to bringing the United States out from under this British imperial type dictatorship from Wall Street, from the City of London, and to bring the US and China and Russia together around development, around ending the pandemic, around building developing sector nations into modern industrial nations. This is the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche, and this is what we must bring to the entire human race in this process, part of which is the getting the truth out about this Green New Deal. I think we can.
Okay. No, I think that's a good place to end, unless you have any final notes, Mike.
That's good. That's exactly the point. We can leave it there.
All right. Okay, well, join us in circulating this pamphlet, getting this out far and wide, organizing whatever networks you can think of, friends, family, you name it. But this is the battle of our lifetimes. We cannot allow this great reset to succeed. And more importantly, we must bring the world envisioned by Mr. LaRouche. So join us next time on the site, and again, circulate that pamphlet. Bye.